All right, Joe, we'll say good morning. Beginning by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors, for the month of Shvat, the Elbaum family, for dedicating all the Shir and Drashos this month. For the yard site of Jerry Elbaum, Yaakov couple, Ben Avram Menachem. Thank Brachas Shimber for dedicating all the Shir and Drashos this month in memory of her husband Avi Avram Ben Kalman Eliezer Halevi. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas will have an Aliyah and the families a Nechama. So just make sure that I didn't. Good, perfect. All right, the boss. It's a beautiful daf. A really incredible daf ahead of us today. So today's daf is Pei Beis 82. A lot of good halacha, a lot of good tumah. It's always good tumah. I've yet to meet the bad piece of tumah. So the Gemara says as follows. So we're picking up 81b at Gufa. It's about you see where Tosas Hamotzi is? Hamotzi Mace. So it's right across in the Gemara there, about 4 lines down. So Gufa, right at the 2 dots. Gufa. So we referenced this case in yesterday's daf. Hamotzi Mace Mushkav L'Rachbo Shal Derech. So we'll say if a person finds a corpse and the corpse is lying across the width of the road. Now remember, we're talking about a corpse that is buried. This is Tumas Hatahom that we're referring to. So I walk across the road, I find that there is a corpse, or afterwards, after I cross, I find that there was a corpse that was buried there. So what's the halacha, we'll say? What's the halacha? The truma tamei, the nazir va'osa pesach tar. For truma purposes, I am tamei, but for nazir and pesach purposes, I am tar. So again, we saw this yesterday, because remember again, there is no such thing as tumas hatahom by truma. Concept doesn't exist. So therefore, it turns out for truma purposes, I walked over a corpse. Okay, true, it was unknowing. I didn't know it was going to happen, but lamaisa, I did it, and therefore, ultimately, I am chayiv. When I say chayiv, I'm tamei. But however, for nazir, right? So when we speak about the case of nazir is a person was a nazir, is coming in contact with tumah. So the shaila is, does that tumah exposure end his neder nizirus? And for carbon pesach purposes, they are exempt, or I should say, tumas tahom does not impact them. The Muslim doesn't impact them. Beautiful. So that was yesterday. So the Gemara says, when is this so? When is this so? Second. When is this so? The Gemara says, this is only so, I'll say, if the corpse was arranged across the width of the road, in a way that halacha l'maaseh you cannot have gotten past it. In other words, this is talking about where mamish, the road is so narrow, essentially, or so narrow that the corpse mamish goes across the entire width. So there was no way, if you were on that road, that you did not pass over the corpse. But halacha l'maaseh again, if the road was wide enough that you could have gone ahead and passed by the corpse without walking over it, after trumatar, then ultimately, again, for truma purposes, you also tar, which again, very intuitive. Furthermore, when is the corpse metame you for truma purposes? That's only if you found the corpse fully intact. But if the corpse is broken or the corpse is in pieces, tahar shema beina prakim avar. Then we'll say ultimately it will be tar. Why? Because it's possible that you walked in between the pieces. In other words, we'll say the only time, essentially what the Gemara is saying is the only time that we're going to declare you tamei for truma purposes is when there's absolutely no way that you did not come in contact with that corpse in some way, shape, or form. But if there's a possibility that somehow you passed over the corpse without coming in contact with it, we won't make you tamei. However, again, if the corpse itself was found inside of a grave, then even if the body is broken or in pieces, the kever, a grave itself, a formal grave itself, goes ahead and combines the corpse into one unit. When is this so? Furthermore, again, this is only true if you are traveling by foot. Avol, ta'on, or rachov, but I will say if you're carrying a load, or for that matter, again, you're riding in a wagon, tamei, you're automatically tamei. Why? Because we'll say if you're just stam walking, in other words, not in a wagon and not with a load, it's possible that if the body is in pieces, that you walked around it. Aval ta'on or rachov, But if halacha l'maisa, you're carrying a burden, right? You're carrying a burden, right? Or you're in a wagon. See, what's the common denominator between a wagon and a burden? So remember, the area is much wider than you, right? If you're carrying a burden, the assumption is it's not a little backpack, but rather, again, it's a piece that extends on each side of you, which means that by definition, even if you were careful somehow to avoid walking over the corpse, the pack that is on you was mahil, definitely went over the corpse. And every time, the same thing in a wagon. If you pass over a corpse in a wagon, the entire area of the wagon has the ability to form a ohel for tumas ohel. Furthermore, when is this so? But tumas hatahom, aval b'tumah yodua tamei. Ultimately, furthermore, again, when do we say that for Nazir and Pesach purposes you're not tamei? That's only for tumas hatahom. But in regular tumah, halacha l'maaseh, you would be tamei. Now, we'll say, here's what's amazing. Now we come to the end of the sugya of tahom, tumas tahom, and now we get a definition. By the way, the Gemara says, "Ve'ezu hi tumas hatahom." Isn't this great? Right. So now, by the way, what is tumas hatahom? What is it? Kol shelo hikir ba echad b'sof ha'olam. We'll say tumas hatahom is the type of tumah that no one knew about. No one in the entire world knew about it. Aval hikir ba'echa b'sof ha'olam ein zeh tumas tahom. But if someone knew about it, that's not called tumas tahom. So the Gemara gives examples. Matzah tamun b'teven ba'afar b'tzraros harei zeh tumas tahom. If you found the body hidden in straw, in dirt, or in pebbles, in rocks, so that's tumas hatom. Because I will say again, remember, there's no foreseeable way that you would have assumed that you're going to find a body in a pile of straw, or for that matter, again, under a pile of rocks. However, b'mayim ba'afila b'nekike hasloim ein zeh tumas hatom. But if you find the body in water, or ba'afila in darkness, or in the clefts of a rock, that's not tumas tahom. Because I will say, remember again, that's the type of situation where you could have seen the body. In other words, in the case of the straw, the earth, the stones, you could walk right over it and never really see it. But the truth is, in water, darkness, cleft of a rock, you should be able to observe that. Therefore, it's not tumas hatahom. Below amru tumas hatahom, ela lemeis bilva. So we'll say, therefore, the Gemara says essentially is there's three parts to the what is tumas hatahom? Three parts to the definition. Number one, let's go a little bit out of order. Number one, it only applies to number one, it's a corpse. It's a corpse that a person cannot have reasonably seen. There was no way that I could have reasonably seen it. That's the examples that the Gemara gives. In a pile of straw, in a pile of dirt, in a pile of rocks. I cannot reasonably foreseen it. Number two, no one knows about it. They kind of go hand in hand. No one knows about it. And number three, it only applies to tumas mace. So I will say, interestingly enough, as we close out this sugya of tumas tahom, so the Rambam actually discusses this. And the Rambam in Hilchos Naziros, Perek Vav, chapter 6, halacha yud ches and yud tes says as follows: Ezui tumas hatahom. Suppose it's really fascinating. So I want to point out this is brought down in Hilchos Naziros because remember again, tumas tahom is it's fascinating. It's only a din in Nazir and Pesach. It doesn't apply to any other area of halacha. Remember again, for all other hilchos tumas hatahom. So if I walk over a corpse that's buried in a pile of straw, no way to know about it. No one knows about it. Again, I'm still tamei for truma, tamei for the Beis Hamikdash, tamei for everything else. It's dafka only for Nazirus and for Pesach. So easy tumas hatahom. What's tumas hatahom? Kol she'ein adam akira afilu b'sof ha'olam. A person doesn't know about it. And I will say, now you ask yourself, how do you know that? No one in the world knows about this tumah. So obviously what the Rambam is saying is that the body is there in a way that it's reasonable to say no one knows about this. Right? You find, Rahman, they just had this avalanche in the Himalayas, right? So, Rahman, years later, you find the body buried underneath piles of, nobody would know, reasonably, nobody would know about it. So the Gemara says, so the Rambam says, "V'lo amru tumas hatahom ela lemeis bilvad, aval haruglo shahar yodea bo zeh shahargu." This is great. I mean, not great. Tumas hatahom doesn't apply to someone who was murdered. Right? Let's say you find a person who was killed, you find them under a pile of stones. Well, so why doesn't it apply to someone who was murdered? Says the Rambam. Why not? Someone knows. Who knows? The guy who killed him, right? I don't mean to smile about this, but you understand, it's an interesting idea. So the Rambam says, tumas tahom dafka only applies not only to a tumas meis, to someone who died, but it must be someone who kind of, because for lack of a better term, died of natural causes, and somehow the body was just hidden. But again, if somebody was murdered, tumas home does not apply. The Rambam goes weiter. He says, Nimtza meis galoi ein zeh tumas home. Okay, so then he goes and he gives the examples of what it means if the body is revealed, if the body is hidden, so on and so forth. Good. Both sides, that is the sugya of tumas home. Shkoyach. Says the Mishnah. Nitma shalem oruba. We'll say another fascinating case. Let's say the Karban Pesach. Again, we're still with Tumah. The Karban Pesach, the entire Pesach became Tameh. So we'll say whatever the Metzias is, right? So this is where, remember, you've gone ahead, you shechted your Pesach, and let's say now the Pesach becomes Tameh. Okay, so now you can't eat it, or rubo, or the majority of the Pesach became tamei. Sarfin osifnei abira me'atzeh ma'aracha. So you have to burn the Pesach. You burn it in the Beis Hamikdash. Lifnei abira. Rashi points out over here that no Rashi yet. Sorry. So bira both say Rashi's well, we're going first time. So bira just means the Beis Hamikdash. We'll see. It really means the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash, or even on Har HaBayis. So you go ahead and you burn it by the Beis Hamikdash, me'atzeh me'aracha, and you use wood of the pyre in the Beis Hamikdash to go ahead and burn the remnants of the carbon. Nitma mi'uto, but however, again, if only a little part of the Pesach became tamei, or v'hanosar, or I'll say, let's say nothing became tamei, but alocha l'maisi, you had left over from the carbon Pesach, you didn't finish all carbon. That's called nosar. Sarfin oso b'chatzero sehen, o al gago sehen. So what's this? Very interesting. If a small part of the carbon became tamei, or nosar, you don't have to bring that back to the Beis Hamikdash to go ahead and burn it. Rather, you burn it wherever you are. You burn it in your backyard. You burn it on your rooftop in Yerushalayim, because that's where you have to eat Karban Pesach. And ultimately, again, you use your own wood. So we'll say, so an interesting halacha. If the majority or the entire Karban Pesach becomes tamei, you burn it by the Mikdash with wood of the Mikdash. If a small part of your carbon becomes tamei, or your nosar, you're left over in the Karban Pesach, you burn that by your house in Yerushalayim with your own wood. Listen to this. Hatzikinin, all right, Tzaikonin, Serpent Osaf Ne'abira B'Shole Hanas Matzemaracha. The Tzaikonabose means the misers. The cheap people who didn't want to use their own wood would bring their nosar and would bring even a small part of their carbon, which became tamei, to the Beis Hamikdash to burn it there. Why? Why schlep it there? Because it was ultimately, again, because they didn't want to use their own wood. Because the good part is, if you bring it to the Beis Hamikdash, you could use Beis Hamikdash wood. If you burn it by your house, you have to use your own wood. Good, we'll analyze. Says the Gemara, my taima. Says the Gemara, what's the reason for this? Why is it that if the entire carbon becomes tamei, that halacha l'maisa we burn it in the Beis Hamikdash? What's the reason? This is incredible. Kedei levaishan. Because we want to embarrass the owners of the Karban Pesach. Now, what's the pshat? We assume that if someone's entire Karban Pesach became tamei, that means they weren't vigilant with it. And so there's Karban Pesach shaming that goes on over here. So we go ahead and we make them burn it in the Beis Hamikdash, which is a pretty public spectacle, especially in Erev Pesach when everyone else is preparing their Pesach. This Chabura now is burning their Pesach to shame them. You weren't careful, and there's no better way to get people to be vigilant and careful than with the threat or with the fear of shaming. Says the Gemara, Nitma mi'uto. However, again, if only a small part of the carbon became tamei, you go ahead and you burn it in your home or on your rooftop. Says the Gemara, or minhu, is that true? But we saw this before. That Allah, so let's say that you left Yerushalayim and you realized you have some sacrificial meat with you. Now remember, so you can't eat any sacrificial meat, right? Kachim kadashim have to be consumed within the precincts of the Beis Hamikdash. Kachim kalim have to be consumed within the walls of Yerushalayim. Here, you left Yerushalayim, and you realize you have some shlamim meat with you, whatever, some sacrificial meat with you. So what do? So the Gemara says, Im avar sofim sarfim komo. If you already passed Sofim, which was a place outside Yerushalayim, then ultimately, again, you burn it where you are. You don't have to go back. However, halacha l'maisa, if you're closer, in other words, if you're closer to Yerushalayim, then what? Top of Pei-Beis, chozer v'sarfo lifnei habira me'atzeh ma'aracha. You go ahead and you bring it back to the Beis Hamikdash, and you burn it with the wood of the Beis Hamikdash. Now what do you see from this case? This is a case where what are you leaving Yerushalayim with? Only a very small amount of meat, right? This could just be a little bit of meat. And yet even for a little bit of meat, what do you have to do? You have to bring it back to the Beis Hamikdash and burn it there. Does this not contradict the Mishnah? Our Mishnah said, if only a small part of your Karban Pesach became Tameh, where do you dispose of it? Right? Where do you dispose of it? You dispose of it in your home, right? By your rooftop, ultimately again in your home. And yet here we're seeing that halacha l'maisa, you have to go back to the Beis Hamikdash. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, this is incredible. Amar Rav Chama bar Ukva lo kashya, kan ba'ach senoi, kan ba'alabayis. Both say it depends who we're talking about. One is talking about an ach senoi, a visitor, and one is talking about a balabas who lives there. So both say, so remember again, the ach senoi doesn't have wood. He's a traveler. He's a visitor. He doesn't have any wood of his own. So for him, we tell him, go back to the Beis Hamikdash. But if someone is a balabas, which is what the Mishnah is talking about, you have a home in Yerushalayim. You have a home in Yerushalayim, so then ultimately, again, burn the meat by your own home. Rav Papa Amar, no. Haba haba achsenoi. Both cases are talking about a visitor. Kan shehichsik baderech. Kan shelo hichsik baderech. One is talking about, again, I will say, we're halacha l'maisa. You already really, again, hichsik baderech means you're established in your traveling. You're already into your journey. So if you're already into your journey, halacha l'maisa, we don't make you go ahead and lachser ala itzim, Rashi says, right? Lachser ala itzim. So halacha l'maisa, if you're already traveling, we don't make you go ahead and you find wood. But if you haven't been machzik in the derech, you have to find your own wood. Says Rav Zavid Amar, no. Li'olam ki da'amar me'ikar. Rav Zavid rejects Rav Papa and likes Rav Chama bar Ukva. That halacha l'maisa, we make a distinction between achsenoi and a balabas. Our Mishnah, which says that if a small part of your Karban Pesach became tamei, you should burn it in your home, is referring to a case where what? You have a home. You have a home. You're a balabas. You have a home in Yerushalayim. So if a small part of your Karban Pesach became tamei, don't bring it to the Beis Hamikdash. Burn it at home. The brayso that we just quoted over here that said that halacha l'maisa, if you left Yerushalayim with sacrificial meat, you're not too far out, you have to come back and burn it by the Beis Hamikdash, is talking about a traveler. So a traveler doesn't have his own wood. So therefore, just tell him, all right, go back to the Beis Hamikdash and burn the sacrificial meat in the Beis Hamikdash. So Rav Zavid, Amrli O, Kidar Mei Kara, Kam B'Achsonai, Kam B'Alabayis. The Apa Gab Del Hichsik Baderech, Achsenoi, and even though the Achsenoi, ultimately, again, is not firmly embedded in the journey, hasn't gone too far. Kevan de les lay asu kitzakinin. Since he doesn't have wood, Chazal essentially made him like the miser. Well, because what did we see about the misers? This nan hatzakinin sarfin also ifne abira b'shvile hanos mi'atze ha'ma'aracha. Ultimately, again, the misers, Rabbi said, would always burn their leftover Karban Pesach in front of the Beis Hamikdash or by the Beis Hamikdash. Why? Because they didn't want to go ahead and use their own wood. So Rabbi say, so it comes out as follows: the way we're going to accept Rav Chama bar Ukva's interpretation, right? So Rav Chama bar Ukva's interpretation is that when the Mishnah says that if you have a little bit of Karban Pesach left over, you should burn it in your home, not at the Beis Hamikdash. That's a reference to a balabas. Balabas. So you have a home, you have your own wood, burn the little bit of leftover ultimately in your home. But if someone is an achsenoi, and they don't have a home, they don't have wood, in all cases, they would just go back to the Beis Hamikdash and burn it there. So that applies in a case of Karban Pesach where a person doesn't have a home. It also applies in the case of a person who left Yerushalayim, ultimately again, with sacrificial meat. And that if he's not too far out and we make him come back, we make him go back to the Beis Hamikdash, ultimately again as a tova to him. This way he doesn't have to find wood, and he could go ahead and burn the leftover sacrificial meat in front of the Beis Hamikdash. Beautiful. Tan Rabbanon, bo l'sarfa b'chatzor saying ume'atzeh ma'aracha in shomalan. Let's listen to this. So now another brayso about burning leftover Karban Pesach, or coming Karban Pesach. If the owners of the Pesach wanted to burn the Pesach, so let's say either a case of where it became tamei or you have no sar, they want to burn the Pesach in their chatzar, in their courtyard, me'atzeh ha'ma'aracha, from the wood of the Beis Hamikdash, ein shomen lahem. We don't allow that. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. You can't take wood from the Mikdash to burn the Pesach in your backyard. That you can't do. Similarly, furthermore, you can't bring your own wood to the Beis Hamikdash and burn the leftover or Tamei Pesach on your own wood. So we'll say, essentially what the Bryce is saying is like this. There are really two options for disposal of leftover / Tamei Carbon Pesach. A, Beis Hamikdash with Beis Hamikdash wood, your home with your wood. But you can't bring Beis Hamikdash wood to your home, nor can you take your wood to the Beis Hamikdash. So the Gemara says, okay, let's analyze. I understand why I can't bring Beis Hamikdash wood to my chatzar. Because I will say, what's the concern? It's a very simple concern. I'm going to bring back a stack of wood from the Beis Hamikdash to go ahead and burn my Carbon Pesach, which, by the way, technically is fine. What's the concern? There's going to be extra wood. And what's going to happen? I'm going to use the extra wood for my fire, right, to heat my home, for a barbecue the next day. And I will say, that's Me'ilah. So in other words, I want to point out, technically speaking, to go ahead and take Beis Hamikdash wood to burn leftover or Tamei Carbon Pesach is technically legal. That's fine. That's not Me'ilah, because that's actually appropriate usage of temple property. The concern is, I'm going to bring home wood, there's going to be extra wood, and I'm going to use it for something else. That's where the Me'ilah issue truly sets in. That's why I can't bring Beis Hamikdash wood to my house. In my time. I'll also listen to this. But why can't I bring my own wood to the Beis Hamikdash? In other words, that should seem to be a good idea, right? I'm being Mahana the Beis Hamikdash. So why can't I bring my own wood to the Beis Hamikdash itself? Says the Gemara. My time alone. Rav Yosef Amar Shalola Vayish Es Mishaino. So both say this is seriously. All right, so the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, so what's the pshat? So the pshat over here is in order not to go ahead and embarrass someone who doesn't have. So we'll say this is incredible. I gave him Musar. You don't have to. So the Gemara says as follows. So we'll say this is actually incredible. What's the concern? If Reuven ends up bringing wood, right, and Shimon doesn't, so we'll say what ends up happening. So we'll say it's very interesting. Remember, it's very interesting to see kind of how trends start. So once the trend starts, it becomes the norm, and anyone who can't conform to the norm feels a little bit left out. So what's going to happen? This is incredible. If people begin to bring wood to the Beis Hamikdash, and I both say, again, that's a form of donation. I don't need the Beis Hamikdash to use this. So let's bring my wood. What's going to happen? Reuven's going to have, Shimon's not going to have, and suddenly again we have Busha. I both say, what you begin to see is absolutely something amazing, which is, in general, Chazal wanted uniformity in communal practices. In other words, we see this really in two dramatic areas. Number one is death, right? Where again, we still remember, it was a number of years ago already when we saw Maseches Moed Katan. We saw this concept that in the beginning, rich people would bury their dead, in very elaborate ways, and poor people felt the pressure to put on, 5-star levayas. So what ended up happening? They ended up dumping the corpses on the side of the road, right? Because the financial pressure to put on a 5-star levaya, to mortgage your house, for a levaya was just too. So Chazal said everybody buries the same way, plain linen shroud, plain wood box, and that's it. There's a chachma. It's interesting. I think there have been many attempts to try to do the same thing for chasanas. I think in the Hasidic community they have a lot more success with these type of things because there's a much more close to community. But there's something to be said for establishing a norm in particular areas, not to stamp out individuality. Of course, it's nice to make, but certain things which are public and create social pressures, what a bracha it would be to kind of lower the bar a little bit so no one feels an expectation. Again, if you have the means to do it, fantastic. But for the people who don't, there's an incredible pressure. See, here you see Chazal said, we don't want you bringing your own wood. Don't bring your wood to the Beis Hamikdash. It's a donation. Whoever heard of a Jewish institution refusing a donation, right? The Beis Hamikdash says, no, thank you. No, thank you. Because if you do that, you're going to create this sense of pressure, and then it's going to turn the Beis Hamikdash experience into something that is unpleasant for many. Such an incredible Gemara. So the Gemara says as follows. Rava says, Mipnei Chashad. Rabbi Sabah said there's another issue with bringing your own wood to the Beis Hamikdash. This is fascinating. What's the concern? But say, imagine this scene. I go, right, part of my Korban Pesach becomes Tameh. I go to the Beis HaMikdash to go ahead and burn the piece of Tameh. And I bring my own wood. But then what happens? I brought too much wood. So what am I going to do with my surplus wood? What am I going to do with it? I'm going to bring it home. Now let's say, so what happens when I'm walking out of the Beis HaMikdash with a pile of wood on my shoulder? What does that look like? Somebody sees that. What do they automatically assume? It's Beis HaMikdash wood. No one thinks that that's my wood that I brought. I had surplus. They assume that when I'm walking out, I'm walking out with Beis HaMikdash wood. So it's chashad. It's chashad. Ultimately, again, I leave myself open to suspicion. So again, I want to be clear. Everyone's agreeing you don't bring your own wood to the Beis HaMikdash. The machlokes is why. So you have Rav Yosef saying, so you shouldn't embarrass someone who doesn't have. You have Rava saying, because we don't want anyone to suspect you of pilfering Beis HaMikdash wood. What's the practical difference? The icy kani, the chariyusa de lo chazila marach. I will say the nafkamina would be a case of what happens if you bring reeds and twigs. So they don't use reeds and twigs in the Beis HaMikdash. They only use, zaftig pieces of wood. So I will say, so if you go with the approach that ultimately there's a chashad issue, no one's going to be choshish me. I'm taking Beis HaMikdash wood when I'm walking back with some reeds and twigs because they don't use it in the Beis HaMikdash. You're going to realize I brought it, I'm taking it home. But if it's an issue of embarrassing those who don't have, that applies even with reeds and twigs. Incredible. Tanan Hasam, Rosh Hamamot, Hayumamid, Eshat Tmein, Al Sharim Mizrach. We'll say this is a great case. So listen to this. We'll say the Rosh Hamamot was the person who was in charge of the Ma'amados. Or Rashi says over here, Hamamuna Al Kach. So really, the truth is, Bepashtos, this was the Kohen who was in charge of the shift of Kohanim. So also remember again, the Kohanim are split up into multiple Batei Avos or multiple Ma'amados, multiple groups, right? And those groups served a week in the Beis HaMikdash, and amongst those groups, each Beis Av, each family served on a different day. So we'll say, so now what would happen if you had particular Kohanim who were supposed to serve in the Beis HaMikdash that day, and they became Tameh, let's say the night before, so they weren't able to serve, what would happen? The head Kohen, the Rosh Hashanah, he would go ahead and put the Tmein on the eastern gate. Now the eastern gate is how everyone entered into the Beis HaMikdash. So he lined up the Tamei Kohanim by the eastern gate. My time, on Rav Yosef, Kedei Levaishan. Rav Yosef says to embarrass them. How could it be? You get to serve in the Beis HaMikdash maybe 2 days a year, and you couldn't be vigilant enough to watch yourself from becoming Tamei? We shamed the Kohanim. Tumah shaming. Right? Tumah shaming. We went ahead and we put them on the Shara Mizrach. Everyone should see, look at these guys. They could not be vigilant enough just for one day to be able to serve in the Beis HaMikdash. Rav says, no. It's not too much shaming. It's chashad because what's the concern? The concern is if people see these kohanim and they're not working in the mikdash, people might just think that they're lazy, right? Ultimately, again, or as Rashi points out, people might say they didn't want to take a day off of work. It's interesting. They didn't want to take a day off of work. Maybe they have jobs that pay better money. They didn't want to take off a day from work, and that's why they're not showing up for work in the Beis HaMikdash. Therefore, what do? We put them by the eastern gate. Everybody should see them walking. And people will say, Aaron Cohen is not working. Okay, he's Tamei. It's not because he didn't want to take off a day from his day or a day from his day job. He has a better job, so he didn't want to miss work. No, he's Tamei. That's why he can't do it. My ben Abba. So what's the practical difference between these two opinions? Ikabenayu mifanki. Let's say so. An interesting nafkamina would be a mifunak. Someone is very fastidious. In other words, we'll say, means someone generally who's too delicate to work. So someone who's too delicate to work, halacha l'maisa, everyone knows that if he's not working in the mikdash, it's not to do other work. So therefore, there wouldn't really be a need to put a guy like this by the eastern gate. Inami the gadil shishura, or a person, his profession is tying ropes, braiding ropes. Braiding ropes, we'll say, was a very unglamorous profession, which paid very little. So if someone had a profession of being a rope braider, no one would suspect them of taking a day off from the avoda in order to go ahead and braid ropes. Okay, but the Gemara is just bringing it down because it's another example, ultimately, again, of the shaming issues, right? Again, you had Rava saying we don't want you bringing your own wood to the Beis HaMikdash in order not to shame someone. The Gemara just shows an example over here of shaming someone. They would line up the Kohanim, the Tamei Kohanim by the eastern gate, who became Tamei. So that again, when you know that there's a fear of public shaming, halacha l'maisa, again, it causes you to be a bit more vigilant. Same idea. if your entire Karban Pesach became tamei, you had to burn it in the Beis Hamikdash, which was a very public thing that people should see that apparently you were not vigilant enough with your Karban Pesach. Good. Said the Mishnah, both say, HaPesach shiatzo shenitma yisarif miyad. Both say, listen to this. If a Pesach goes out of its approved area, in other words, both say, let's say halacha l'maisa, you take the Pesach outside of Yerushalayim, or shenitma, or it becomes tamei. What's the halacha? Yisarif miyad. You go out and you burn it immediately. Nitmu habaylim o shemesu. But I will say, if the carbon itself is fine, but the owners became tamei, or for that matter, again, the owners died, to ubar tsuraso, the yisarif b'shishasa. So also we're going to see that certain times when a carbon has to be burnt, you can burn it immediately. Other times there's what's called tu'ubar tsurasa, which means its form has to change, which is another way of saying lina, you leave it overnight. The distinction the Mishnah is going to make is when the carbon itself becomes disqualified, you burn it immediately. When the carbon is fine, but something else precludes its usage or consumption, for example, the owners become tamei or the owners die, then there's lina. You leave it overnight and you burn it the next day. Now, in the case of Karban Pesach, when you say burn it the next day really means what? Not the first day of Pesach, the 15th of Nisan, because you can't burn disqualified kachim on Yom Tiv, but rather it means we actually leave it until the 16th, which is effectively the first day of Chol HaMoed. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baruch Omer, Af zei yisaref miyad, lefi she'en lo ochel. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baruch says, no, even the Karban Pesach, where the carbon is fine, but the owners are either tamei or dead, could also be burnt immediately, for there is no one to consume it. Says the Gemara, Bishlama tamei ksiv. So I understand if halacha l'maisa, the carbon becomes tamei, you burn it immediately, because the pasuk says, V'abas rashi yigabachol tamei, lo yochal ba'ish yisaref. Because the pasuk says, that if you have meat that became tamei, lo ye'achel, it cannot be consumed by ishi sarif. So the Gemara says, I understand that. Elo yotze minalan. But how do I know that if I took a carbon outside of its prescribed area, let's say I took the carbon outside of Yerushalayim, how do I know that it's burnt as well? So the Gemara says, Dechsiv hey lo huva es dama ela kodesh pinima. So we're going to see this is in the aftermath of the death of Nadav and Avihu, where ultimately again the chatos that Aaron offered, he immediately burned. So Moshe Rabbeinu asks Aaron, why did you burn the chatos? Maybe you didn't bring the blood to the inside. Amar la Moshe Aaron, here's the conversation. Why did you not eat the chatos? Why did you burn it? Shema nichnas dama lifnai v'lifnim. Maybe you brought the blood of the chatas inside of the kodesh. The blood of the chatas is supposed to be sprinkled on the outside of Mizbeach, not inside the kodesh. So maybe you brought the blood out of its prescribed area. That's why you're going to go and burn the chatas. Now, Amar lo lav. So Aaron said, no, I did nothing wrong with the blood service. Amar lo shema chutz lemechitzasi yatzasa. Maybe you took the carbon or the dam outside of its prescribed mechitzas. Amarlo lav ba kodesh haisa. Then Aaron says, no, it remained in the kodesh the entire time. Amarlo iba kodesh haisa vehelo huvas dama la kodesh pinima madua la achaltemosa. So then Moshe says to Aaron, I don't understand. If ultimately again the carbon was in the kodesh and you did not bring the blood to the kodesh and you didn't take the carbon out, then why did you burn the chatas? Then I will say, what do you see from here? Mechladi nafka inami ayol dama lifnim basrefi. You see from this exchange that Allah l'maisa, if the blood is taken out of its prescribed area into somewhere else, either into the Kodesh or outside of the Mishkan, that would be reason to burn the carbon. So from this exchange, you see that whenever a carbon is taken out of its prescribed area, halacha l'maisa, that mandates sreifa. So bishlama nitma galerech wana bekachim kalam kol shekim bekachim kadoshim. So I say, I understand in the case of that carbon becomes tamei, the Torah tells us by kachim kalam, because the pasuk we quoted is by shlamim, which are kachim kalim. So the Torah tells me that if the carbon becomes tamei, by kachim kalim, it's burned. Certainly that applies to kachim kadoshim. However, eliyotze ashkechan kachim kadoshim, kachim kalim. Now, Rabbi say with the concept of yotze, namely that if a carbon is taken out of its prescribed area, that it's burned. That's only taught us by a chatas, which is kachim kadoshim. How do you know that the concept also applies to kachim kalim? V'su. Furthermore, hodesanya, that which we learned, lon dama. So we'll say if the blood remained overnight, amud beis, nishbach dama, or the blood spilled, yatsa dama chutz lekilayim, or if the blood was taken outside of the curtains of the Beis Hamikdash of the Harabais, the Kaimalon, the Sreifa Minalan, how do I know that blood, and ultimately again that carbon, is halacha lemaisa subject to Sreifa? Nafgalon mid Rabbi Shimon. We'll say, learn after Rabbi Shimon. What did Rabbi Shimon say? Disanya, Rabbi Shimon Omer Bakodesh Ba'ish Tisarif. The pasuk says in the Kodesh, right? Bakodesh Ish Tisarif. Limeid Al Chatos Shesreifasa Bakodesh. It teaches me about Chatos, Rabbosai, that if a Chatos, now where do you burn the Chatos? Where do you burn the Chatos? Bakodesh. Now we'll say, Rashi says over here that Bakodesh means the Azara. The Azara. Where do you burn the chatas? You burn the chatas in the azar, in the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash. Ainly elazu bilvad. I only know that the chatos is burned in the azara. Sharp psulei kachei kadoshim ve'imurei kachim kalaminayin. How do I know that this doesn't apply to just chatos, but any time you have an invalidated kachei kadoshim or sacrificial limbs of kachim kalim, how do I know they're also burned in the azar? Tamalomar. V'kol bakodesh ba'ish tisarei. Because the positive will say anything in kodesh is burnt in the Aish. And now we understand over here that this is a reference to burning it in the Azara. Ashkechon Kachei Kadoshim. I know that this is referring to Kachei Kadoshim, Kachim Kalim Minal. And how do I know that this applies to Kachim Kalim? So I was supposed to say, I understand that Kachei Kadoshim must be burned inside of the Azara. But how do I know that the same concept applies to Kachim Kalim? Elo Kol Pisulo Bakodesh Bisreifa. Rather, we'll say we have a klal. Anytime you have an invalidated sacrificial item, it is burned. And I will say this. So there's two things we're learning out over here. Anytime that a sacrificial item becomes invalidated, number one, the way you take care of it is with streifas, with burning it. And number two, the location. Where do I burn it? I burn it in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Azara. Loshna kachim kalim, veloshna kachei kadoshim, Gemara Gemirila. We'll say ultimately, again, it is a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. So halacha l'Moshe Misinai that whenever you have to dispose of a disqualified sacrificial item is through sreifa. And number two, ultimately, again, it's done in the Azar, it's done in the Beis Hamikdash. V'chatas da'aron. So I will say, this is interesting because the truth is, we thought that we learned this out from the episode or the exchange of Moshe and Aaron, because that's what the Gemara was doing on Pei Beis and Madalith, right? The Gemara was talking about why Aaron, why did you burn the chatas? You're supposed to eat the chatas. Why did you burn the chatas? And Moshe begins to ask Aaron a series of questions, right? Maybe you took the blood out from, maybe you took the blood somewhere it's not supposed to be. Maybe Allah you took the carbon where it's not supposed to be. Which you see from Moshe Rabbeinu's questions that had Aaron indeed taken the blood somewhere it wasn't supposed to be, or taken the meat somewhere where it wasn't supposed to be, or there would have been some other disqualification that would have warranted the burning of the invalidated carbon inside of the Beis Hamikdash. So the Gemara says, but just understand, we don't learn that halacha from the story. The story, the Gemara says, V'chatas da'aron mishum ma'aseh shahaya kach haya. That's just the story. I mean, not just the story, but the halacha is not gleaned from there. In other words, we'll say there is a halacha l'Moshe Misinai that tells us that whenever you have a disqualified sacrificial item, halacha l'maisa, you take care of it through sreifa, it's burned, and ultimately, again, it's burned in the Beis Hamikdash. That's halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Ulatana debei Rabba Baravua damra filu pigul ta'un ibor tzura. And we'll say, listen to this. And according to the Tana of the Beira Baravua, who said that even pigul, right? Pigul, I also remember again. Now, what's pigul? Pigul halacha l'maisa again is when you go out and you shech the carbon, and you have in mind that the carbon should be consumed outside of its permitted window. So I'll say that's pigul. That's pigul. So even pigul isn't burned immediately, but rather pigul is left overnight. Ton ibut surah lon. Where do we know that from? So the Gemara says yaliv avon minosar. We learn out the gzer shav of avon and nosar. We'll say just like nosar by definition is left overnight, so too again pigul before right is left overnight as well. V'neilif oven mechatas de Aaron. Why not learn out oven from the Gzer Shav of Aaron, where again the disqualified carbon was burned immediately? The truth is, in a situation like Aaron, which is where what the Kohanim became, right, slipped into aninos, right, they became onanim. If that were to happen again, in Achinami, they would not have burned that chatas immediately. they would have left that chatas overnight as well. V'hasam hora'asha haisa. But rather, you know, say the circumstances surrounding the chatas of Aaron were unique. But if that situation were to unfold again, the Kohanim were to become onanim, they would actually leave the carbon overnight, they would not burn it immediately. But say, this goes back to the principle in the Mishnah. The principle of the Mishnah is as follows. Whenever there is a disqualification in the carbon itself, you burn it immediately. Whenever the disqualification is not in the carbon, but is in who? Is in either the Kohanim or the owners, then there's two bar tzura, so we let the form change, which means you leave it overnight. So technically speaking, in the case of Aaron, where the Kohanim became onanim, the carbon was fine. It was the Kohanim who were not. Technically speaking, if a Kohanim were to come to ask that shah, we say leave it overnight. But in the case of Aaron, was an exception. That was Harasha, that was something unique. Hashta darmina kol psulei de kodesh b'sreifa. So we're saying now that we know that any invalidated sacrificial item is disposed of through burning. Loshna the kachim kadosh and loshna kachim kalim gimara gemirila. So ultimately, we're saying now that I know that's halacha l'moshe misinai, namely that any carbon that becomes disqualified is burnt. That is halacha l'moshe misinai. Bakodesh ba'ish tisarif lamali. Why do I need the phrase? What do I do with the pasuk of Bakodesh Ba'ish Tisarif? So the Gemara says, "Homi ba'ilei shesrei fasa Bakodesh." That teaches me about say so Bakodesh Ba'ish Tisarif. So remember again, the Halacha Moshe Misinai apparently by itself only teaches me that invalidated sacrificial items are burnt. What doesn't it teach me? What doesn't it teach me? Where the pasuk of Bakodesh Tisarif ultimately teaches me that the sreifa itself takes place in the Kodesh in the Beis Hamikdash. Va'abasar sheyiga b'chol tamei lo yochal lo yachel ba'ish yisarif lamali. So we'll say, what do I do with the pasuk? Va'abasar sheyiga b'chol tamei lo yochal ba'ish yisarif. Notice if it's halacha l'moshe misinai that sacrificial meat which becomes invalidated is burnt. What do I need the pasuk for? Lamali hahu legufei itzdarich. I need this pasuk for itself. What does that mean? I will say saladait chamina, because I might have thought. First wide line. Kol psulei de kodesh kegon lon dama v'nishbach dama v'yata dama v'nishcheta b'layla v'b'sreifa the lesson of b'cholis. You will say, I would have thought like this, that what does this halacha apply to? Any type of psul, like for example, the blood was left overnight, the blood was spilled, the blood was taken out of its prescribed area, shchita was done by night. These are the type of invalidations which warrant the burning of the carbon. Why? Because they don't apply by unconsecrated animals. Aval nitma de bechulin nami mifsa. But Rabbi say, let's say when it comes to tuma. Now tuma applies to chulin also. What do you mean tuma applies to chulin? If a tummy animal, right? If a chulin animal becomes tummy, it can't be offered up as a carbon. So tuma does apply to chulin. Ema hoilvis avid bei uvdin dechol. I would have thought that I will say that what's the type of invalidation which halacha l'maisa warrants the burning of a disqualified carbon? What type of disqualification that mandates the burning of the carbon? Only a type of disqualification that's unique to carbonos. But if you have a type of disqualification that applies to non-consecrated animals as well, perhaps it shouldn't require sreifa, but kavura, burying it is enough. Kamash Malano. Kamash Malano will say that any type of disqualification ultimately warrants burning in the Beis Hamikdash. So Rabbi say, what comes out over here is as follows: that halacha l'maisa, there is a halacha l'moshe misinai, that any time there is a disqualification in the carbon, the way we deal with the carbon is burned. It's burned. Where does the sreifa take place? The sreifa takes place b'kodesh, in the azara of the Beis Hamikdash. Good. Let's go back to Nitmu habaylim oshe mesu tu batzras. And so remember again. So case number 1 in the Mishnah was there was a deficiency in the carbon itself. The carbon became tamei. Right? Case number 2 is the carbon is fine. Something happened with the owners. Right? The owners died or the owners became tamein. So what do you do with the carbon? You leave it overnight and you burn it the next day. As we pointed out, next day doesn't literally mean next day, but rather next day for Korban Pesach purposes means actually 2 days later, the first day of Chalamayid. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yosef, Machlokes shenitmu by achar zrika. So we'll say, so remember again, then in the Mishnah then quoted the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka said, no, when the owners became tamei or the owners died, you could actually go ahead and burn the carbon immediately. So Tanakama says, we wait to burn the carbon until the first day Chalamayid. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka says we burn it immediately. So says the Gemara, Rabbi Yosef, Machlokes shinit mubaylam achar zrika. The machlokes Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka and the Rabbanon is only when the owners became tamei after the zrika. Because we'll say ultimately again, since the owners only became tamei after zrika, interestingly enough, the carbon was fit, right? The carbon worked. It worked because halacha l'maisa, the zrika occurred. Aval nitmu bailim lifnei zrika, but if the owners became tamei before zrika, the lois chazi basar la'achila, the meat was never fit for consumption. Divrei hakol yisarif miyad. Everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa you should burn the carbon immediately. So we'll say this is very interesting. So Rabbi Yosef positing that the machlokes Rabbanon and Tanakama, or I should say Tanakama and Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, is only when the owners became tamei after zrika. So they became tamei after zrika, which means the carbon Pesach was fit for consumption at some point in time. The Tanakama will say, leave it till tomorrow to burn it. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka will say you could burn it right now. However, again, if halacha l'maisa, the owners became tamei before this zrika, everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa you could go ahead and burn it right now, since essentially the carbon was never fit. Rashi says, or Rabbi, take a quick look at machlokes. It's the fourth white line in Rashi. Machlokes of zrika. Hasam palik Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka the chashiv le psula begufo. So it's very interesting. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka will say when the owners become tamei before the zrika, that's considered to be like a disqualification in the carbon itself. That's why you could burn it immediately. The Tanakama savar mikamakom lo ba psulza ela machmas davar acher. So we'll say the Tanakama holds that no, when the owners become tamei, it doesn't matter before zrika, after zrika. Halacha l'maisa, well, that's what we thought. Halacha l'maisa, the psul is in the owners. Okay, so Meisvei raise the kasha. Meisvei zaklal kol shepisulo begufo yisarif miyad v'dam ubebaylim tubar tzuraso ve'etz the beis hasreifa. So we'll listen to the klal. The klal is any time that there is an invalidation in the carbon itself, yisarif miyad, the carbon is burned immediately. However, v'dam ubebaylim, if there's a disqualification in the blood, you spilled the blood, you left the blood overnight, or a disqualification in the owners, to uber tzuraso, leave it overnight, ve'etz the beis hasreifa. Katani bailim dumya dedam. So we'll say the Bryce is equating bailim to dam. Ma dam lifnei zrika, just like the psul in the dam is before zrika. Af bailim lifnei zrika. So too again the disqualification of the owners is also before zrika. Rather, again, if you this is what you have to say. The machlokes is when the owners became tamei before zrika. The lois chazi basar lachila. And therefore, again, it's treated like it's a psul begufo. So we'll say that's when there's a machlokes. If the bailim become invalidated before zrika, then Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka will say burn it immediately. It's like there's an invalidation of the carbon. Tanakama will say no, that's an invalidation of the owners. Aval nitmu bailim la'achar zrika, chazi basar la'achila. But if halacha l'maisa the owners became tamei ultimately again after zrika, where again I will say the meat became fit. Divrei hakol psula machmas davar acher ubai ibur tzura. Everyone will agree that halacha l'maisa you leave the carbon overnight and burn it the next day. So we'll stop over here. But again, what the Gemara is ending off with over here is the nature of the machlokes. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka and the Tanakama is as follows: if the machlokes is when the invalidation in the carbon, or I should say when the owners became tamei before zrika. But if halacha l'maisa, right? I'm sorry. Yes, the machlokes is when they became tamei before zrika, because again, Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka will teach that, will look at that as a psul in the guf of the carbon, and the Rabbana will look at it as a psul ultimately again in the owners, and therefore Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka will allow for immediate incineration. The Rabbana will hold that halacha l'maisa you have to go ahead and wait until the next day. But if the psul occurred after zrika, where the meat was sacrificially fit for consumption, then halacha l'maisa again everyone will agree that that's called the psul machmas davar acher. The psul becomes as a result of something else, and you have to wait until the next morning to burn the carbon. We'll continue with this concept in Meretz Hashem tomorrow.